Welcome, everybody, to the Future Security Initiative Spring Speaker Series. We're really thrilled to have two extraordinary thinkers on Sudan here today. And we welcome all of you. The event tonight is called The War in Sudan, Understanding the Most Deadly Current Conflict and What the U.S. Can Do to Help. And we have our ASU colleague, Pamela DeLargy, a professor of practice in global studies and director of Education for Humanity, ASU's program to provide educational access for refugees in host communities in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. She has 3 decades of humanitarian response and public health experience. She's a Horn of Africa specialist. She serves on the advisory board of many humanitarian organizations, including the Sudanese American Medical Association. And also joining us is Suliman Baldo, senior advisor for the Enough Project, previously directed the Sudan Democracy First Group. He's a former UN independent expert on Mali and independent Commission of Investigations in Cote d'Ivoire, former Africa director at the International Center for Transitional Justice, as well as the International Crisis Group, and formerly a senior researcher at Human Rights Watch. I just want to mention for those who remember him is just to recognize our colleague who passed, Abdullahi Galab, who's really a prominent Sudanese thinker, a journalist, and a sociologist and professor here at ASU. Really briefly, this is a conflict that is not getting a lot of attention, certainly not in relationship to the suffering of the conflict. It's the largest forced displacement crisis in the world, with over almost 9 million of those displaced in the recent conflict. Half the population in Sudan faces serious hunger situation. Many, over 150,000, have been killed in the conflict. It's complex and difficult and has many years related to what's going on now at different moments. So we're thrilled to have our colleagues here. Very briefly, this will be a conversation between Pamela DeLargy and Suliman Baldo, and then we'll have a time for Q&A from everybody. And just to do that, you type your questions into the Q&A box in Zoom. And again, thank you all for joining us, and we welcome our guests.
Thank you, Daniel. Welcome, everybody. I think those of you who are watching this webinar today probably already know a bit about Sudan, but for those who haven't been following this conflict much, it's, as Daniel said, not received the level of press attention that many other conflicts in the world have received, given the level of displacement. 3.5 million Sudanese in exile now, 9 million internally displaced, given the level of humanitarian need, 18 million people with acute food insecurity, with over 500,000 already reaching levels of starvation, damage to infrastructure, to schools, to health facilities, to bridges, to everything from the National Bank to the National Museum. Today, there was over the past 2 days, there've been a lot of activity. The Sudanese armed forces have actually retaken most of Khartoum city now, including the airport some hours ago. So things are shifting, but the militia groups that are fighting the Sudanese armed forces still maintain control of large parts of the west and the southern part of the country. I'm just going to be asking Suliman some questions here about this, and maybe I'll pipe in with different things. One of the distinctive aspects of this conflict is that it is involving, one way or the other, every neighboring country, and Sudan has lots of neighbors, all the way from Libya, Chad, Central African Republic, DRC, Southern Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Egypt. Every single neighbor is involved in one way or another. Regional groups are also involved, as well as global powers. So maybe we'll start, Suliman. A lot of people are wondering about these, the RSF. Who are they? Who is this famous Mr. Hemeti, who is been accused now, is on the US sanctions list, and has been accused now of so many atrocities in Sudan? And how did this all come about? There were hopeful times for a number of years until 2 years ago. There was a wonderful democratic revolution. The dictator for 30 years had been overthrown. Young people were in the streets. There was flourishing freedom of expression and high hopes for Sudan. And then the falling out between the two military leaders. But there's a lot of background to that too, especially on the side of the RSF. Suliman, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Thank you. It's a long story, but I will try to represent it, briefly. The Rapid Support Forces are today's incarnation of the Janjaweed militias of the war in Darfur of 2003-2004, in which the Sudanese army recruited these groups from communities of Arab, background in Darfur to repress at the time the communities of African origin whose sons have joined a rural insurgency against the government of Omar al-Bashir at the time. This is a dictatorship that lasted from 1989 and fell only in 2019, 30 years later, under the pressure from a popular mass protest, civil disobedience campaign that really stuck to nonviolence against a very brutal dictatorship. So the Rapid Support Forces have that background. They were fighting the counterinsurgency in Darfur at the time by proxy for the Sudanese army. And this is a tradition in the Sudanese military establishment, fighting wars on the cheap by recruiting ethnically based militias to suppress at the same time rural insurgencies and urban uprisings against the dictatorship of Omar al-Bashir. In 2013, that militia was integrated into the Rapid Support Forces, and the Sudanese army invested enormous resources in training, equipping, and arming the Rapid Support Forces as an auxiliary paramilitary force to fight counterinsurgencies on its behalf and to repress urban unrest. And to reward the Rapid Support Forces and the army, the regime of Omar al-Bashir, which was basically a leading kleptocracy at the global level, it was really structured to privatize the resources of the country for the benefit of those in the inner circle of the regime in the dictatorship. They, of course, needed this security establishment to protect that hijacking of the natural resources. So both the army and the Rapid Support Forces were given latitude to develop corporate empires, operate independently from the oversight of their own government by the consent of that government and acquiescence of that government in all sectors of the national economy: mining, energy, construction, manufacturing, commodity trading. The difference between the army financial empire and the Rapid Support financial empire is significant, because the Rapid Support Forces preserved their essence or their core structure of a militia, but was developed into a regular force by the Sudan Armed Forces. And by the time of the fall of Bashir, this force was 100,000 strong. The army delegated to the Rapid Support Forces the entire, infantry function of a modern army, and therefore it was, an army of officers and some technical, army corps such as, Air Force, Armored Division, that they denied to the Rapid Support Forces. They formed it as the mobile, force. Economic competition between the Rapid Support Forces and the army over their competing, corporate holdings was the key factor driving this conflict. However, both the army and the Rapid Support Forces were together in protecting Omar al-Bashir. When that regime fell, the security establishment didn't fall with it. And therefore, they forced themselves on the civilians who brought down Omar al-Bashir in 2019 into a cohabitation between the military and the civilians in the transitional period that began in 2019. That cohabitation ended in 2021, barely 2 years later, because the army and the rapid support forces jointly staged a coup d'etat because of the economic reform policies that the civilian, reform-minded government of Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok, implemented, that began to threaten the base of their, hegemony over the national economy. That's the main driver of this. A key driver is also the influence of Sudan's Islamist movement. This is how it is called. It is the extension in Sudan of the Muslim Brotherhood ideological movement, which is very well known to you all, and which over the 30 years of Omar al-Bashir was the power behind the throne. It was the power behind the Bashir regime, empowering its members to take control in all institutions of the state and to create parallel institutions to those of the state, so that the ideological movement, the ruling National Congress Party, which is its front in public, continue to monopolize power and wealth. So this is all about competition over resources, and the insistence of both parties to prevail, so that they are the only ones to be in that position.
Can you say a little bit about gold? Because there's been a lot of discussion about the role of gold, the role of, for instance, maybe the Wagner Group, gold exports to the Emirates, etc.
So a major, this is a very extractive, dictatorship. Sudan was oil-rich in the decade between 2000 and 2011. Much of the wealth was privatized, hijacked by the ruling elites under Bashir. And then South Sudan became independent, and with it, all the oil revenue, like 75% of the oil revenue disappeared, which was the main source of revenue for the government. Around the same time, gold emerged as the major new natural resource. And gold in Sudan, which is the third largest producing country in Africa, from 2010 onwards until today, is largely dominated by traditional artisanal miners. 80% of the gold in Sudan is produced by small-scale artisanal miners. And the trade in the gold sector dominated by the private sector. So it was quite a struggle for the government first to tax and raise royalties from these traditional miners. And the government introduced policies to encourage better control over this resource, such as encouraging the growth of the treatment of the gold tailings left behind by the artisanal miners. So there are companies that are specialized in this and that sector, which is like semi-industrial, grew very fast. And then they try to encourage international gold mining companies to invest in Sudan, but the conditions in the country, which during most of Bashir's, or the entire period of Omar al-Bashir was under U.S. blanket economic and financial sanctions, did not encourage, reputable international mining companies to introduce modern mining in Sudan. So gold in Sudan became, a sort of a conflict mineral issue with both the army, rapid support forces getting involved in the way that I explained to tap into this resource and enrich their respective corporations and enterprises. With the rapid support forces, this richness went to the family of the commanders. Hemeti and his brother Abdurrahim Dagalu are the #1 and #2 top commanders, of the rapid support forces. And in the case of the army, The companies are owned by the state, but they are completely managed by the Sudan Army Officer Corps, and all the revenue and the profits from their operations across other sectors as well are kept for, showering the Officer Corps with benefits and luxury, handouts and so on. So the gold, therefore, is a rich resource, but it hasn't benefited the producers, 1 million of them, who are, providing livelihoods for their families through remittances. 4 million of Sudanese depend on that as a result of this structure of the industry in Sudan. They are the least who are getting any returns from that wealth. Sudan produces, in average, about 60 tons a year. The production, which is officially acknowledged, varies considerably from one year to the next. But the average over a period of 10 years, from 2010, when statistics became, are more available from the Ministry of Minerals, about 60 tons. Half of that quantity, is smuggled out of the country. And when I say smuggled, it is, most likely exported off the books by companies of the Sudan Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces. But all the gold of Sudan ends up, without exception, into the United Arab Emirates, either smuggled or officially exported to the United Arab Emirates. And this is where we know the difference between the official figures of the production and what the United Arab Emirates declare for international trade statistics, what it imports from Sudan in every single year of gold and the value of that gold. There is a large variance between the two.
I know you've been following the money on this issue for many years, well before this war started. So we really appreciate your shedding light on what is a really complicated situation.
It is. It's really multi-layered and multiple overlapping conflicts in one.
From the beginning of the conflict, many Sudanese were identifying the Emirates as playing a pretty negative role in the situation and supporting RSF, and that went on, I guess, it was a year and a half before the rest of the world started paying attention to that aspect. I think finally now UK and the US are recognizing the role of the Emirates in providing not only a place for the smuggled gold to go, but also contribution of arms and other factors through Chad. But others in the beginning were saying, well, wait a minute, the Emirates has a lot of investments in Sudan, a huge amount of agricultural land investments. They import food, they import livestock, they import minerals. What is their interest in supporting one side of this conflict?
Emirates have huge geostrategic ambitions, but it doesn't have the human strength to sustain these ambitions. The Emiratis are few in number, but they have large ambitions to control, the Horn of Africa, the Sahel region, North Africa. We see how they intervene in Libya and so on. They need an army for hire. And they have used both the Sudan Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces as armies for hire in the war in Yemen against the Houthis, starting in 2015. When Bashir was, summoned to Riyadh and made to agree to, civil relations with Iran, which was very close to his regime at the time, and joined the international coalition led by the Saudis and the Emiratis in the war in Yemen. And this they did by providing, boots on the ground to fight the Houthis in the war in Yemen. Except that, given the structure that I explained to you, the very aristocratic officer corps, which is delegating to proxy forces warfare on its behalf, the Rapid Support Forces were deployed in the Southern Front in direct confrontations with the Houthis. And they gained a lot of combat experience because of that. And also a lot of training by the Saudis and by the Emiratis on warfare to adapt to the war in Yemen, which is very similar in terrain to the situation in Sudan. While Sudan armed forces were deployed to the border between Saudi Arabia and the northern border of Yemen. And therefore, they weren't, at all engaged in combat, deployments as in the case of the Rapid Support Force. And this explains to a large extent how the Rapid Support Forces in the first almost 18 months has consistently prevailed in battlefronts against the Sudan Armed Forces because of all the investment of the Sudan Armed Forces itself and of the Emirati Saudi allies across the Red Sea in building the capacity of the Rapid Support Forces. Not only this, the Saudi Arabia and the Emirates paid enormous sums, billions in terms of rial, dirham, dollars, both to the Sudan Armed Forces and to the Rapid Support Forces, first for the soldiers deployed and then for the institutions themselves. And this money never went to the government, even under Bashir, who made that arrangement, because he was happy to see that the security forces protecting his regime were, given all these resources. But this was a major tool that the army and the Rapid Support Forces together, when they were allied during the transition in 2019 to 2021, they used these resources to choke the civilian-led executive, which was trying to, to reform all these distortions in the national macroeconomic system. So the United Arab Emirates had all this interest, but it's also, driven by ideology because it is opposed to the Muslim Brotherhood movement, and they don't want to see the Muslim Brothers come back to power in Sudan. That's a major motivation. One last detail. United Arab Emirates paradoxically is extending a lifeline to the Sudan Armed Forces because Sudan Armed Forces and the government it controls out of Port Sudan relies entirely on almost entirely on the United Arab Emirates for clearing its international financial transactions out of state-owned banks that have branches in Dubai and in Abu Dhabi. And therefore, United Arab Emirates could simply turn that off and create chaos for the Sudan Armed Forces. And what is good for business of the United Arab Emirates is good is good for them. And therefore, they don't shut that lifeline. And despite all the diplomatic disputes, of the government of Sudan taking the United Arab Emirates to the International Court of Justice, for instance, recently, that bizarre relationship continues because both parties are finding, an interest in it.
I know that there are some American Congress people who have actually introduced bills to halt military aid to the Emirates, in part because of the Emirati support to the RSF in Sudan. We'll see how that goes. But it's also part, as you were talking about the ambitions of the Emiratis all along East Africa. They're of course interested in managing every port. Exactly. from the Red Sea down, all the way down. So there are those issues too, but it's a little bit hard to keep up with who's on what side here. Egyptians have always pretty much been in support of the SAF, providing air support sometimes. The Iranians, strangely enough, also are involved, providing drones and other things. And partly this has to do with the Yemen issue and with their relationship with the Emiratis. So poor Sudan is just a pawn in lots of other larger relationships. I think we can't ignore the role of Libya and the Libyan National Army and Khalifa Haftar, who also was supporting RSF early on. Russia has some interesting interest in the area, discussion with the Sudanese government about a naval base there near Suakin. and has kind of gone back and forth, I guess. I haven't heard much about the Wagner Group lately, but surely early on they were supporting RSF. Even Ukrainians have been involved in this conflict. Some of the special forces there trying to work against the Wagner Group. So Sudan has become a kind of field site for many other battles going on, a place for proxy wars around the whole region. The relationship with Ethiopia, is a little bit fraught because of the issues of the Grand Millennial Dam and the damming of the Nile, and that a little bit tense there between Sudan and Ethiopia off and on. That's unclear. And then I think Eritrea now firmly in support of the SAF. So it's a regional war, really, when we think about it. But as it's gone on, and there have been more investigations into human rights abuses and atrocities, and especially some of the things that have been going on in the West, in Darfur and in Kordofan, that are clearly ethnic cleansing. And now I think it was in January 7th that the US government actually adopted a statement saying that there may be genocidal intentions or actions of the RSF, though the US has sanctioned both entities from SAF and from the RSF too. So my question to you is, with all of this going on and everybody trying to play a role in mediating, the Saudis tried, IGAD tried, Kenya wants to try, everybody wants to try. But with more and more information coming out about the atrocities which are happening, especially by the RSF, how is it that a country like Kenya can roll out the red carpet for Hemeti and treat him like a head of state? How is it that he can visit Rwanda and visit the memorials there with a straight face? How is it the South Africans can roll out the red carpet? Are they seriously interested in mediating and are just trying to be fair to both sides somehow as a mediator, or are they hedging their bets and thinking, RSF may prevail here and we want to have decent relations with him? What do you think about that?
You are referring to the visit to East Africa and South Africa back in February, I think, of 2024.
Yeah.
After a period where everyone thought Hemeti was killed in combat, but
right.
He resurfaced during these visits during which he was treated as a senior official, sovereign, state. Here, I suspect that the United Arab Emirates used its diplomatic leverage and its logistical support to allow Hemeti to have that profile of a responsible, senior sovereign state official. And therefore, the role of the Emirati in this is really central. They also lent him the business jet that flew him from one country to the other in the South, in the East Africa and Southern Africa regions. Most recently, Kenya actually hosted meetings in February of a large number of civil groups, armed movements, and associations who came together to develop and adopt a charter for a parallel government in RSF areas. And this is where, we had a backlash from the Kenyan free media and, civil society organizations questioning President Ruto on why he's compromising the neutrality of Kenya as a regional power that could help mediate the conflict in Sudan. And again, I think the influence of United Arab Emirates must have made this possible. Now, Kenya, among all the African countries, is the closest to the new, Trump administration. And with signs that there is going to be serious trouble in South Sudan in the violent succession for President Kiir. A couple of days ago, Secretary of State Rubio called Kenyan president and discussed with him the situation in Somalia, which is very tense, with the Shabab, resuming activities and threatening Mogadishu, and again with with the situation in South Sudan as well. Briefly mentioned Sudan. So it appears that the trend is for the U.S. administration to delegate. Are you hearing me? I see that I signed, or everyone signed off. Sorry, are you okay? Did you follow me for the last few minutes? Because you were frozen.
Yes. Sorry, somehow it got frozen.
Okay, yes, okay.
Carry on.
We are in business again, yeah?
We are.
So I was saying, I detect a trend in the Trump administration with regard to conflicts in Africa to delegate to the regional allies. In the case of South Sudan, it will be President Ruto of Kenya. In the case of Sudan, most likely, it would be United Arab Emirates and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and to a lesser degree, the Egyptians, Turks, Qatar, to bring the belligerents to the table and have them agree to the first step to a humanitarian cessation of hostilities. So this is the trend. I wouldn't expect that you will find reference in the statements of Secretary Rubio or the new administration of conflicts in Africa at all. It will be working through their regional allies to advance U.S. policy interest in the region.
I see we have a question here from Richard Loban. Hi, Richard. He's asking, if the SAF prevails, what will then happen to Hamdok? What would happen to Bashir?
Bashir, hi, Professor Loban. Good to run into you again. And I'm glad you are here. So SAF is trying to give itself a political constituency. And therefore, there are political actors who, opted to provide that constituency, which are the forces opposed to the Forces of Freedom and Change, which were led by Abdullah Hamdok, and which after the war took the name of Tagaddum, Progress, and now Sumud, Perseverance. That's the situation. The Sudanese army, made changes in the constitutional document that established the transition in 2019 to give itself some legitimacy. But those changes empowered the army to appoint the Chief Justice, to appoint the Auditor General, to appoint the Prime Minister and his members of his cabinet, and dismiss any of those entities. Therefore, total militarization of governance already built into these amendments of the constitutional documents. And with that done, the Sudan Armed Forces is now, Burhan is talking, the Lieutenant General Burhan, the commander of the army, is talking about appointing, an emergency government or a caretaker government, which they have failed to do since 2021, since the coup d'etat, because of the really massive pushback from the population and isolation from international community. So this is what's going to happen on the side of the army. Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok today leads this broad coalition of forces that are calling for an immediate end to the conflict and restoration of Sudan transition to democracy. It's called Sumud, which means perseverance, and it is active in mobilizing all those Sudanese who are opposed to the war and want to see it ended as soon as, or immediately, ended immediately, and to move to a phase of humanitarian assistance, civilian protection, and a political phase as the second step, whereby a post-conflict dispensation is identified that could restore that democratic transition. So this is where we are. But Bashir and all the stalwarts of his regime are free under the protection of the Sudan Armed Forces today as we speak. And they are, driving the war from behind, using the influence of the Islamist movement of the Muslim Brotherhood among the senior army officers, and obstructing any intention of, any inclination of the army to enter into negotiations. We see them taking to the air, social media, attacking Burhan each single time he makes reference to going into negotiations.
I suppose there's no chance of Burhan turning Bashir over to the ICC then.
Zero chance. Sadly, I mean, this is a reality, yeah.
Okay, Ruth Eob, hi Ruth, is asking, what about the role of Addis and Asmara in all of this? Both of them have long borders with Sudan, many different issues that cross the borders. Sudanese have fled to Ethiopia in some numbers right now as refugees. What do you see? What do you see happening now, and what do you think might happen in the future?
The obsession of President Isaias Afwerki of Eritrea is to interdict any role for Ethiopia as a regional power. Abiy Ahmed somehow managed to recruit Eritrea in a sword, in Tigray, that devastating war, which again was ignored by the international community totally, despite the million victims among civilians that were decimated by this war, and the attacks on systematic attacks on civilians, both by the Ethiopian and Eritrean army. However, both countries have now fallen entirely apart. There are rising tensions among them. There is accelerating mobilization by Ethiopia, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, and by Isaias Afwerki, and they are going to fight over control in this internal dispute within the Tigray region. That means, we are going to witness a perfect storm in the Horn of Africa region, with clouds, dark clouds of a major conflagration of Ethiopia, Eritrea going after each other, and in South Sudan, a descent into, resurgence of civil war in the current, competition among Salva's senior officials for his succession, with the situation that we know in Sudan. Isaias has threatened to intervene in the war in Sudan if rapid support forces, reach eastern Sudan in their offensive, the areas that are, have joint borders with Eritrea. Isaias Afwerki and the Eritrean army have trained militias Sudan forces that are from eastern Sudan, and therefore he is placing proxies within the conflict in Sudan that are still actually provided with provisions from Eritrea, with the acquiescence of the Sudanese army. So you see the level of complexity. Abiy Ahmed is trying to stay out of trouble by not intervening or supporting one side or the other in the in the current war, although his sympathies, I would say, would rather with the rapid support forces. Why? Because the family businesses of the commanders of the rapid support forces have large investments in Ethiopia, and in fact they have also large investments throughout East Africa, including in Rwanda, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. This is not very well known. However, this is the situation, and this in part explains the alignment of President Ruto with the rapid support forces commanders. So it's really a complex conflict formation of several conflict, domestic in Sudan, actually at the community level as well, given the involvement of all these ethnically based militias in conflict that have their own agenda and their own priorities in their immediate, environment against or with other communities. And, you have these cross-border, interactions between Sudan and all these other countries that you mentioned at the beginning.
The Eastern Sudan has always been very interesting. I think Eritrea has off and on supported the Bija Congress, depending on what was going on in Sudan, but always to try to play a spoiler role one way or the other.
That's the expertise of CSF.
We probably haven't talked enough about what's going on in Darfur and in Kordofan. What has happened in Janina? 500,000 Sudanese crossed over into Chad, which already had quite a lot of refugees to support, but Chad itself also playing a suspicious role in all of this. But at this point, the RSF has pretty firm control over large parts of Darfur, and Fasher is under siege. And there are some things coming up in international media now, and I know it was in Addis recently, this was raised there by some people in ECA, like about a potential division of Sudan. That hurt my heart to hear that. But evidently that's something that people are discussing. Oh, maybe a solution would be to divide Sudan and leave the RSF in charge of western and southwestern parts and SAF on the other parts. Would that be as big a disaster as I think?
It is going to be definitely a huge disaster, because Sudan has already suffered, the secession of South Sudan, and after decades of war in which a lot of human lives were wasted by Sudan armed forces in South Sudan in attacking civilians mostly, during the Sudan Liberation Movement civil war, North-South civil war. And therefore, we do have, this ongoing civil war now for more, it's going to be very soon, 2 years. And what is happening actually as a result of developments that, we outlined earlier in the discussion, there is a de facto partition of Sudan now between areas in the east, north, and central Sudan that are firmly under control of the Sudan armed forces, and Darfur region with its 5 federal states, entirely controlled by the rapid support forces, except with the town of Fasher, which is the capital of North Darfur state, which is still defended by the army and its joint forces. Rapid support forces also control, large swathes of the 3 states of Kordofan. North Kordofan, from where I hail, actually, I'm from Al Ubaid, in North Kordofan, West Kordofan, and South Kordofan. And as part of this political coalition building that the rapid support forces engaged in Kenya, they managed to persuade the Sudan Liberation Movement north of Al-Hilo to join the alliance with the rapid support forces. Therefore, the entire area of the Nuba Mountains in South Kordofan now is part of this broader coalition. I would say there is a de facto division of the country into 2 areas of territorial control by the army and their allies, and by the rapid support forces and their allies. And this tells us 2 things. This is not going to be, about secession. We need to recall this very importantly. No one is talking about independence of Darfur or Kordofan into a different state. They are using, the control over Western Sudan as leverage to negotiate from a position of force in any future forthcoming negotiations. Second, the situation on the ground was largely created by very ill-advised policies of the government in Port Sudan, which is controlled by the Sudan armed forces, such as changing the Sudanese pound, banknotes only in government areas to take rapid support areas out of the, the circulation of money. Government, of Port Sudan also began another very serious and ill-advised policy of denying identity papers for people from Western Sudan altogether, pushing them in the arms of the rapid support forces, actually, and creating a sense that, Port Sudan and central, northern Sudan, they do not want us as Sudanese and so on. So reinforcing this drifting apart of the areas of the territorial control. In October of 2024, the rapid support forces made, again, very ill-advised. They're all, taking very serious decisions that have serious repercussions, but, including by hurting their own interest. So the rapid support forces actually enforced a ban of exports from areas under its control to Egypt, because they accuse Egypt of having, enabled the military offensives of the army by, Air Force contribution to that offensive. But also that means no commodities, livestock, minerals, and Western Sudan is the rich production area for all these resources, is no longer going into the areas held by the Sudan Armed Forces. And therefore, this is hurting the government of Port Sudan. It's also hurting the rapid support forces in areas under its control. Why? Because they cannot find alternate markets to the huge Egyptian market for example, livestock, or sesame, or groundnuts, or karkade, all these things are produced in Western Sudan, Dura, sorghum, and so on. There is a list of 12 commodities that are now banned. And there is an active, effort by the rapid support forces to try and find alternate markets in East Africa. And that's why there is this rapprochement between the rapid support forces and South Sudan government of President, Kiir, which is now defended by the rapid support forces, and Kenya, Uganda, as potential markets, or to access international markets through the port of Mombasa. Therefore, the rapid support forces has been very strategic in its military offensives, by taking control of the border between areas of its control in South Kordofan, South Darfur, West Kordofan, and South Sudan. Right. Because we want a free access to trade. Of course, Chad is not a large market for that matter, nor is Libya, which is a source of imports into Darfur and that part of the country. And of course, they need fuel, which continues to be smuggled into the areas controlled by the rapid support forces from Libya by contraband, simply. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, we have a question by Carolyn Fleur-Loban. She's saying if RSF and SAF come to a point of exhaustion and agree to peace negotiations, how can that negotiation carry on within the regional and African context? What would you see? How would you see that negotiation happening? And what do you think might be an outcome?
Okay. This is a semestral exam.
I know. I feel like we're just touching on
a
lot of.
So you said you were coming from Addis Ababa, and we're hearing all these scenarios where there is readiness to accept a partition of Sudan. I have little, hope that, the diplomats in Addis Ababa, or even in the United Nations, are really, taking into consideration all the complexity of this conflict in ways that will help Sudanese to reach, to find sustainable peace in the long term. Right. I told you about the recent adoption by Burhan of, these so-called constitutional amendments that give total power to unprecedented levels, even under the fiercest dictatorship in Sudan, total power to the military. And they also adopted a flimsy roadmap to peace, and concerned that the UN, AU, IGAD would go after documents because they want a framework for founding and negotiations.
Yeah.
So this is a major concern, and it should not be allowed to happen because this completely marginalizes, civilians who are interested in genuine reform, who are interested in putting Sudan in a path that would put an end to this repetitive decade-long civil wars and massive killings of civilians by no fault of theirs. And therefore, the scenario has to be, for negotiations has to be real, something that has not been tested before. Mm-hmm. Now, what could that be? At the current moment, as we are speaking now, there is no active mediation effort, none, zero, from any quarters. The Jeddah talks failed. The Geneva talks, that followed, which is labeled Jeddah 2, which tried to brought all the mediators together around an initiative by the then, Biden administration to address the issue of humanitarian ceasefire only again, and try to define a strategy for a political solution. That again is now frozen, but there is some movement on that front, with the United Kingdom, leading an initiative by inviting the European Union and member states and Norway, also regional actors, including the United Arab Emirates, for which they got a lot of critique actually, but they are part of the problem, and they have a lot of leverage on the parties, as I explained, not only the RSF, but also on the Sudan Armed Forces, given the vulnerability of Sudan Armed Forces for financial pressures from the United Arab Emirates. So that initiative may yield some movement, in the sense that it can have an incremental approach of first realizing humanitarian cessation of hostilities, and if that works, move to other phases for a political solution.
Henia Dakak, hi Henia, is asking about the role of the U.S. and U.S. interest in this, or will they just leave it to the regions? And I want to answer one thing first, and that is to mention that the humanitarian situation in Sudan, of course, is dire. Huge displacement, largest displacement in the world. Every neighbor receiving refugees, 9 million people displaced inside. But it would be much, much worse if it hadn't been for the rather remarkable local humanitarian response of Sudanese in every city and rural area. The international humanitarian community has watched in awe as Sudanese have organized themselves into what we called emergency response rooms, neighborhoods and community groups working together to feed people in the community, to provide health care, to make sure there's water, sanitation, groups of young people organizing themselves to fix the electricity at health centers, to fix the water pumps and all of that. It's been quite remarkable, really, what has gone on in terms of local humanitarian response, which has kept millions of people alive. Some of these emergency response rooms and emergency kitchens, community kitchens, especially in Omdurman, Khartoum, and other urban areas, had received some support from the international community, although it's been erratic, and have been really, really, really severely affected by the U.S. cut to U.S. aid and in foreign assistance overall. So my first answer to Henia's question about what the U.S. should do is to reestablish humanitarian support for local humanitarian efforts inside Sudan. Otherwise, there is really a disaster. The support was stopped overnight. There was no time for other donors to step up. There was no time to fix supply chains, which got stopped. There's food sitting in ports. There's medicine sitting, in countries nearby that was supposed to go there that hasn't moved there. So in that sense, the U.S. policy in terms of foreign assistance and humanitarian assistance has been pretty disastrous for the Sudanese people. But politically, Suliman, what do you think the U.S. could do to try to have some positive impact on these negotiations?
They should start by not doing harm. I think that's very important. What I'm observing now is that there is total, ignoring of the crisis, not only in Sudan actually, but all the major tensions that are existing across Africa, and particularly in the East Africa, Horn of Africa region. You know, the transactional approach of what is in it for us, you know, that the U.S. would only engage with situations where there is some return for, U.S. interest and America fairest interest, is really, the wrong way to go. And I believe that this should be communicated by all advocacy groups that, there are situations in the world whereby if you allow things to evolve in their own dynamics and under their own, momentum, you end up with major, national or even in regional level disasters that could destabilize global peace and security. Imagine that there is a merger of the conflicts in Sudan and in Ethiopia, Eritrea war, and civil war, which is already underway in South Sudan. If all this comes together, the humanitarian disaster that you described will be 10 times more.
Exactly.
Millions who are, displaced and under attack. And there will be destabilization of the Red Sea security. And we know all the talk about the Houthis and bombing the Houthis to preserve, the safety of commercial, traffic on the Red Sea and so on. Sudan has more than 800 kilometers, of Red Sea shore.
Right.
And talk about Eritrea and so on. And that's why actually Russia and Iran are there, because they're seeking basing rights on the Sudanese Red Sea shores. This is what is driving Russia to be part of the active and very vigorous supporters of the military effort of the Sudan Armed Forces. And therefore, ignoring the crisis in Sudan and in the region is going to be very costly. And so far, this has been the default position, just ignoring what's going on there. Again, this is very, very called for. I'll leave it at that.
I guess we're ending this on some kind of pessimistic notes, but and have only hit on just the surface of many of the complex dynamics in the subregion and in the region altogether. But thank you so much for providing all this background information. I know you are deep into all this, and it would be great to have another session sometime looking at some of the specifics.
Looking forward to it, yeah. Now,
Yeah,
it's
let's
not
do that.
really a negative note. Sorry, Professor. I just want to remind people of the very positive note that Pamela mentioned about the local response, humanitarian response by emergency response rooms and community-based, soup kitchens and so on. This is a huge ground, bottom-up, local response to the humanitarian disaster, and it's totally, self-financed and so on.
And I have to give a shout out to the Sudanese American Medical Association, who've been doing amazing things with volunteers going in and out and training medical and health workers, trying to keep medical care going too.
And providing funding, I'm aware of their effort. Yep. And really, high regard for that effort. They are providing funding for a small, basic, community health centers across in safe areas as well as in conflict areas at a great risk to the local health workers who are involved. So that's the kind of effort that, and now there is an initiative for crowdfunding to replace the little funding that was coming from the USAID that went to the emergency response rooms. And I think that should be encouraged, definitely.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. Special thanks to Suliman Baldo and to Pamela DeLargy. We're so fortunate to be able to learn more about this devastating situation in Sudan. We're thrilled to organize another event to keep this conversation going. And again, thank you, everybody, and have a very good night.